This is the study session on economics and the reading on understanding business cycles. This would be a good reading for those of you interested in politics, those of you who are interested in economics and economic growth and all the factors that kind of link the two and how economies grow and how they contract. So let's get right into the LOSs. First one asks us to describe the business cycle. And so I want you to think about it this way. The economy is not static. It's dynamic. It is either growing or it is contracting. And so the business cycle is really a description of expansions and contractions. And so the business cycle is really just defined as fluctuations in the GDP over time. And there are expansions, which are defined as increases in output, economic output, and other economic factors. And recessions or contractions are decreases in economic output as seen by specific economic factors. So what are some of those economic factors that are important? Industrial production, personal income, employment levels, wages, profits, sales, and interest rates. Don't forget about interest rates. That's extremely important. The business cycle really doesn't have a set time frame. It's not like the economy says, okay, it's time for us to move in a different direction. And so these are just kind of naturally occurring cycles, and they can be from, a relatively short period, 1 or 2 years, all the way out to a decade or even longer. If you look at the business cycles and the expansions and recessions in the United States over the last, 50 or even 100 years, you can see that. How about the phases of the business cycle? So I want you to focus just quickly on the graph. Notice on the horizontal axis there's time, and then levels of real output on the vertical axis. And notice there's an uphill and a downhill. So we're going up and down and up and down. And so when we're going uphill, that's the expansion. When we're going downhill, that's the recession or the contraction. And so those are upward slopes and downward slopes, obviously. And then the peak and the trough, those are zero slopes. And so that's really the key, is to try to figure out as a financial analyst where the peak is and where the trough is. And if you can do that as a prognosticator of economic activity, boy, you'll be really successful. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about what are some characteristics of each of these phases of the cycle. During an expansion, there is growth in economic activity. And what does that mean? Well, go back to our reading on corporate finance. Remember, the goal of the business is to maximize shareholder wealth. How do firms do that? Well, they find projects that have positive net present values. So think of an expansion economy of firms finding lots and lots of wealth increasing projects. And so what does that mean? That means that that particular company is going to have greater output. And in order to facilitate and to support that greater output, they need to do things like hire more workers or pay more to their current and potential workers. And so there's higher employment levels, and there should be rising wages. There should be rising real wages as well. And then during the expansion, what tends to happen is that since more people are working and more people are making money, they're generating more income, and they have more discretionary income. And so they are going out and spending more. And I want you to think about when lots of people decide to spend more, it's almost like they're in a battle. They run to the grocery store and they're in a battle with other consumers to buy that jar of peanut butter. And if there are hundreds of people fighting for that jar of peanut butter, well, then the owner of the food store and then the owner of the peanut butter making machine are going to realize that, and so those prices are going to rise. So that's typically what happens during an expansion. But then we hit the peak, and I want you to think of it in the following way. During the expansion, we have more money, and so consumers are saying things like, "Boy, I want to go out and buy a new and better smartphone. I need a new and better motorcycle. I need to buy a boat. I need to redo my kitchen. I need all this stuff." And the fact that I'm working and making more money means that I can now afford these kind of things. But after a while, consumers realize they don't really need all this stuff to be replaced. I mean, how many of us buy a new car every 6 or 12 months? How many of us redo our kitchen every 2 or 4 years? How many of us? So sooner or later you realize that you have enough stuff. Now, of course, you're still going to demand things like, food and gasoline for your car and all that kind of good stuff. But sooner or later, there's a natural phase in the economy where the growth rate peaks and the economy reach its productive capacity. And it just can't sustain this for extended periods of time. So then the economy starts slowing down. And one of those first signs of economy slowing down is that producers realize that the inventory is staying on their shelves longer, whether it's gasoline in the tanks, whether it's a sweater at the local retail, or whether it's smartphones. Those economic activity slows down. Now, what that means is for these businesses who are trying to maximize shareholder wealth, they realize that the P times Q, price times quantity, is not going to be as substantial as it has been, so they tend to cut back. They're probably not going to cut wages, but they'll probably cut back on their employment. Overall productivity declines, and then we hit the bottom, we hit the trough, and that's when all these negative trends level off. And then we start the recovery. So that's an important part right there in the trough when we go from the zero slope back up to the positive slope where we can begin the recovery. Now, how about resources and housing and external trades? How does that activity vary as the economy moves through that business cycle? So we're going to ask the question here. Let me just go back really quickly. How do those factors change when we're going up the hill and then we're going down the hill? All right, during the expansion, what happens is that low interest rates tend to encourage business investment. Of course, businesses are going to borrow more when interest rates are low. And on the consumer side, that means that with interest rates are low, they're going to borrow more for big purchases like housing and cars. And I know that I use my, I won't say the name of the credit card, but I use my specific credit card when this company offers 6 or 12 months interest-free financing. So I'm more likely to go out and buy a computer or get repairs done on my car and put it on that credit card when the interest rate is zero. So of course, when interest rates are low, the people will tend to borrow more. Employment picks up. Of course, productivity is increasing, output is increasing, and so firms tend to hire more employees, and then the wages are going to follow, and that should be real wages as well. When we hit the peak, economic growth flattens out, maximum employment, and then it's somewhere along that expansion line, somewhere along that upward slope, inflation becomes a concern. During the contraction, purchasing starts to slow. When consumers are feeling that, they're probably not going to buy as many houses as they've done before. And so their demand is probably going to be less. Companies cut back, lay off workers, and then that decrease in the employment levels is going to result in a reduction in consumer demand. And then with the trough, lowest level of economic growth and contraction, highest unemployment levels, and then, perhaps an expansionary monetary policy is going to encourage new investment. And that leads us right into the next LOS. What about these theories on the business cycle? There's got to be some academics and researchers out there who are thinking things like, okay, here's the business cycle. It is what it is. How can we explain it? And then if there's something that we can do about it, what can we do about it so that we're always on the upward slope and we're never at the downward slope? All right, how about money supply models? These models tend to have the assumption that what's best for the economy is a steady growth in the supply of money. And of course, the money supply is determined by the federal government. And so the Fed here in the United States, they determine that money supply. Those of you who pay attention to this over the last 10 years will know we've had things like quantitative easing, and we've bought mortgage-backed securities and done all sorts of stuff to try to influence interest rates. But here's the thing. An inefficient or a poor monetary policy can really influence aggregate demand and have a great effect on the business cycle. And so these these monetary models rely on the assumption that any monetary policy change that's going to impact the business cycle is going to be done efficiently. And of course, these models believe that inflation is the result of the business cycle, more people having greater incomes, and so they go out and spend that money, and it results in rising prices. Which means then, if you have this increase in the aggregate demand, that the government has to step in and provide some kind of monetary direction to counteract those impacts of inflation. Now, the new classical school theory on the business cycle is one that is based on the assumption that government interventions are probably inefficient and therefore not very effective. In other words, the economic growth is based on the decisions of these rational microeconomic agents, like consumers. And so this efficient decision-making at the micro level, remember that Adam Smith and the invisible hand, those efficient decisions made at the micro level leads to sustainable macroeconomic growth. Now, the Austrian school, this neoclassical thought, means that forces of supply and demand will change in reaction to whether we're going on the upslope or the downslope, and those forces in supply and demand will, in fact, have limiting effects on the business cycle. The free market, the power of free enterprise and free capital markets will naturally arrive at an equilibrium point without the need for government interference. Remember this as a self-correcting economy. Now, the Keynesians think just the opposite, that the economy is incapable of self-correction, and that market forces like supply and demand are not enough to combat these economic swings. So that the government has to do things like spending and control the money supply, and they have to do these during the recessions so that we can avoid a long downward slope, and so that we can avoid a trough, and then we can move back up in the positive direction. And so the Keynesians believe that the government can tremendously influence economic recessions, limit those recessions, and put the economy back on the path to expansion. Now, the issue here is that if the government spends more than it takes in as a tax revenue, then we're going to have a deficit. And deficits seem to be a big problem sometimes with politicians, and not a big problem at other times with politicians. It's too bad this is not a political conversation. All right, how about unemployment? Three primary types of unemployment. So structural occurs when there's really no demand for a specific type of worker. So I go way back in the telegram operator, but this is occurring even today. I'm fascinated when I do happen to go into, a place like a convenience store or a fast food restaurant, and you're really not greeted by anybody. You have the little kiosk right there, and so they say, you want some French fries, and you want some chicken wings, and you want a slushie, and then it just kind of magically appears. So, boy, is that a structural unemployment when we don't really have a need for someone to take our order, whatever that is. I remember when I was just starting to drive, this is when we went from, oh my gosh, you pull up into the gas station, and the people that run the gas station, they have to come out and put the gas in your car because it's so dangerous. It's so dangerous. But nowadays, nobody has any, no gas station has anyone putting their gas in the car, although there are states where it's still required by law. All right, frictional unemployment is caused by, and this is what's going on today, workers changing jobs and transitioning skills from one to another, whether it's that skill set or maybe it's a geographic location or a geographic skill or a particular skill. Here in the United States, these unemployment levels keep dropping and dropping and dropping, and that's because businesses are expanding and they're having better jobs. And so these individuals who've been kind of underemployed because they have really good skill sets now are finding jobs to match those skill sets. And so The unemployment is falling because now in the U.S. we've got individuals finding jobs that are much more palatable with their set of skills. And then cyclical unemployment. Of course, you don't need to have somebody come by and shovel your snow in the middle of the summertime. How do we measure unemployment? Percentage of people in the labor force who want a job but can't find one? Or we can monitor payroll. How about all of these things that sound like changes in price levels? So let's start with inflation. This is the increase in price levels of goods and services over time. And so inflation can be measured various ways, but this is what I always think of in terms of my brain and how to process inflation. It's the following. Let's suppose you have a big old shopping cart and you go and you buy stuff like a computer and a car and a bag of salt and some ice cubes and a lamp and a whole bunch of stuff. You buy all that stuff and you check out. And then a year later you go buy all that same stuff and you check out again, and then you can just do a quick future divided by present minus 1, and that's going to be your level of inflation, the increase in price levels over time. Can be caused by a variety of factors, but clearly if there is more money supplied in the economy after an injection of large amounts of money in the economy, then people are going to have some extra money and they're going to spend it. There are some advantages of inflation. People tend to borrow less. The public tends to borrow less, and the private sector tends to borrow less, and even governments tend to borrow less when there's high inflation or expectations of inflation. And then there's some wage adjustments that when companies tend to resist increasing the compensation for their employees over time. They tend to, but if there's inflation, then it's a lot easier to increase their real wages. Of course, there are tons of disadvantages of inflation, not least of which is an opportunity cost, but primarily the disadvantage is because it discourages all sorts of stuff like savings and investment and hyperinflation. These are extreme cases of inflation. So when does this happen? Imbalances, excess printing of currency, lost confidence. And I bet you guys know some good examples. I think the greatest example of hyperinflation occurred in Germany after World War I, where the government in Germany just started printing money. And I think I read somewhere the rate of inflation, when did World War I end? In the late 19 teens? It was like 30,000% or some crazy number that you really can't even get your arms around. But, in recent years, countries like Argentina and Venezuela and Bolivia, they've had hyperinflation, and it's almost impossible to get out of hyperinflation. What happens is that this is a transfer of wealth to the government. How about deflation? This is just the opposite of inflation when the price levels fall. And so when the money supply is reduced, then price levels will tend to fall because individuals don't have that capital. And then disinflation is a reduction in the inflation rate. And so I have an underlined thing here. Deflation would be minus 2%, while disinflation would be a change from 9 to 8. How about a price index? So the next question is, how do we measure inflation? I gave you an example a few minutes ago just about checking out with a shopping cart, but that's really not practical. It's not even sensical, but we have to figure out a way to measure inflation. And so we use this, the Les Spears method. This was a dude who lived in the 1870s or sometime around there. He was trying to figure out changing price levels. And so this is really what this method does, is that when you go and check out, whatever that number is, that becomes your base. And so the base year has to be 100. And so then you go check out next year. And if the price level went up by, let's say 10%, you checked out and it was 10% higher this year than it was last year, well, then the base index last year was 100, and so this year you would set it at 110. So that would reflect that 10%, because it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, when I checked out with the computer in the car and the whatever, all that stuff that I said, it was $84,622. Well, that's just specific to me checking out. If someone else checked out, there might be some different numbers. And so what we need to do is identify a basket of goods and services to include. And so that second part is, probably the most important. We need to decide what are good measures of inflation. What are good goods and services, appropriate goods and services to include? And so here's an example of how we can calculate a price index. And so we take just two examples of bread and rice. And so in 2017, we bought 52 slices of bread and 36 bags of rice, and then 51 and 38. And so there are the prices. And so the question then becomes, how do we compute the inflation? And so all we're going to do is multiply P times Q. So take the 52 times the $2.59, add that to the 36 times the 89 cents, you get 166.72. So there's the 100 base level. And then in 2018, we check out, so to speak, and it's a little bit less. And that translates into an index of 99.52. So the inflation rate is negative in this example. All right, there's the consumer price index. This is a basket of goods. And so what the federal government, at least here in the United States, tries to do is pick a basket of goods that is representative of all the stuff that U.S. consumers demand over time. They try to avoid things like fads and trends, and they try to avoid things like, putting a new product. I mean, how do you handle it if, last year you bought a bunch of stuff, and then this year you bought a bunch of stuff, and it was the exact same cost, but you bought a new product. A new product for us and our family are these things called Yu-Gi-Oh cards, whatever they are. And so my sons play these Yu-Gi-Oh cards. So my personal inflation has gone up because we demand more of those Yu-Gi-Oh cards, but that's probably in the entire basket. So these are the Les Spears index. So there is a bias against new products. There is a bias against the change in the quality of goods over time. And most of the time you think that the quality of goods increases because, when you buy like laundry detergent, the company figures out how to do it a little bit better. So then they say, hey, new and improved. But sometimes the quality is not quite as good. I think of some examples that I have in my kitchen. They kind of reduce the size. They keep the price the same, but they reduce the size inside of the packaging and sometimes reduce the quality as well. And then there's a bias against substitution. I mean, of course, if we're eating hot dogs all the time and then we increase our income, maybe we're going to move to chicken or steak or something like that. So that's why we did this Fisher index to correct for that substitution bias. And then there's the producer price index, which measures inflation at all different stages of production. I always like to give the example of my 3 summers working in the donut factory. And so that producer price index would be computed as, over those 3 summers, the cost of sugar, how much did that rise over those 3 summers, the cost of milk, the cost of cream, the cost of powder, the cost of flour, corn. I mean, all the stuff that goes in the manufacture of a donut. And so you kind of check out, but you're not really checking out. What you're doing is seeing what those input prices are and how they change over time. All right, what's the difference between cost push and demand pull inflation? Cost push, so think about this. We're pushing, and demand, we're pulling. And so those are 2 good visuals to have when you're trying to distinguish between these two. Cost push inflation is inflation that results when the costs of production, like wages and the raw materials, like the sugar and the flour that I was talking about in my donut factory example. And so what happens is that those costs of production, they go up and they reduce the aggregate supply. And so what happens is that we have to, firms will then increase their costs. So think about the cost of goods sold on the income statement. and then they'll pass those higher costs on to a higher donut cost. So instead of going and buying a donut for 50 cents, you have to go and buy a donut for 75 cents because the sugar and the flour and the corn syrup and all that stuff, those prices have gone up. Demand pull inflation is when aggregate demand, so think about all of us, we're out there, we're buying things, when that outpaces aggregate supply. Too much money chasing too few goods. All right, how about economic indicators? So leading indicators and lagging indicators and coincident indicators. So what we're trying to do is figure out within that business cycle, where are we? Are we in the upslope? Are we going to stay in the upslope, or are we going to do the downslope? And if we're in the downslope, when do we hit the trough? So that's what we're trying to figure out with these indicators. And the important thing is to try to figure out what those turning points are. I mentioned that earlier, that highly skilled financial analysts will be able to identify those turning points. And so the leading indicators are those factors that occur today, and they're going to give us some indication of what's going to happen tomorrow. So these predict future movements in the economy. The S&P 500 index has long been thought of as a leading indicator, and consumer durable goods, net business formations, and then new orders for capital goods. That makes sense, that if companies are making these decisions, that they're going to be based on what they think they can sell at some time in the future. So that if they're ordering more capital goods, then they're hoping that that's going to be productive, of course, and more output, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we know from all of our discussions in equity markets that if you take a look at profitability from the S&P 500 companies and how much investors are willing to pay for those on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, remember, investors buy today based on what those expectations are for future profitability and future cash flow generation is by those businesses. And so lagging indicators are kind of just the opposite. They only change when the economy has, kind of hit a pattern. The employment levels and interest rates, corporate profits from, now remember, this is important. Remember, corporate profits are determined based on, the accountants looking at historical data. So they look at historical data, and that tells us what has happened. It kind of explains why the stock prices have fallen, or maybe why the economy is shrinking. And then there are some coincident indicators, things like GDP and retail sales and industrial production, and certain kinds of employments. They exist during specific economic activities. Now, the uses of these economic indicators are to be able to predict what's going to happen in the economy. Limitations are, it's really tough to predict things like interest rates and economic growth. Interpretations can be tricky. There we go back to our one of our LOSs back in the quantitative methods that says something like, what about the problems of data mining? And so, of course, this can rear its ugly head in terms of collecting data for trying to predict the economy in the future. And it's really difficult to measure GDP from one time period to the next. And that takes us through the business cycle. Next up, monetary and fiscal policy. That'll be fun for those of you who are interested in government activities and how it affects the economy.